Welcome to Macro Monday on Investec Focus Radio SA, a podcast about what's driving global and local markets. I'm Chris Holdsworth, Chief Investment Strategist at Investec Wealth and Investment. Every Monday morning, I'll update you on key developments from the past week and what you need to know about the week ahead. If you'd prefer to watch a video with the graphs and charts I referred to in the podcast, just go to investec.com/Macro Monday.
This week, we'll have a look at some mixed messages coming out of the US economy. We'll have a look at signs that the European economy is rebounding. We'll have a look at the US trade deficit. And finally, we'll have a look at signs that the SA economy might be improving too. We're going to start off with some mixed messages from the US economy. Every month, we track global PMIs. They're the most timeliest estimate of economic activity. Any number above 50 indicates a month-on-month expansion. Any number below 50 indicates a month-on-month contraction. And the latest data suggests that the global economy is rebounding. The global PMI was at 52.4, which is pretty high by recent standards, and does suggest that economic activity across the globe accelerated last month, which was a bit of a surprise. So if we scratch a little bit and look into the detail, the primary reason that the global PMI picked up to the extent that it did was because of the US. We saw a surge in the US PMI series as well. And if we look at countries across the globe, it really was just the US and Spain. But given the US's weight in the global economy, the US is the primary reason why we've seen this surge. And I think we do need to have a question mark around this, because there are some mixed messages coming from the US economy. We're going to touch on those shortly. So I don't think we're at the point now where we can say definitively that global economic activity has accelerated, but there is a sign that it has started to pick up. And the reason for our skepticism is that there's more than one PMI series. In the US, we can compare the S&P PMI to the ISM, and they should give a broadly similar picture of economic activity. But the S&P Services PMI is suggesting that the US economy is very strong, with a reading above 55. But the ISM Services PMI, which should give a similar picture, is sitting at just over 50, indicating that growth is stagnating. So it's quite clearly the case that we are getting mixed messages from the US economy, and it's more broad than that. We're seeing signs that employment is slowing, which also suggests that the US economy is slowing. We've seen bankruptcies tick up. There's a whole broad swathe of data points suggesting that the US economy is slowing, but the S&P PMI series is very strong. But if it continues to be strong, I think we will see widespread upgrades to US economic activity. So this is a very important series. It is different from most of the other things that we're looking at, and we do need to keep a very close eye on it, because it could suggest that we're going to see a quite sizable shift in expectations should that series remain. One negative in that series is if you look at the services prices paid series, which is a key leading indicator for US inflation, it has picked up. And that does suggest that we're about to see a quite sizable increase in US inflation. There's a lag of about 3 or 4 months. So as the series picks up, US inflation typically picks up about 3 to 4 months later. So we do need to keep an eye on this, and it will make the Fed's life difficult if, in fact, US inflation continues to increase.
We hope you're finding this podcast valuable. If you are, please take a moment to rate Investec Focus Radio SA on your podcast platform. And to make sure you don't miss an episode, please remember to follow us.
Switching to Europe, there's signs that the European economy is recovering. And the most obvious of those signs is retail sales. Retail sales growth was very strong. It was well above the consensus forecast. And it just feeds into that broad narrative that the cuts that the ECB did, which were far greater than the Fed, is starting to lead to an uptick in economic activity in Europe relative to the US. And sticking with the US for the moment, we have seen the trade deficit in the US narrowing. So in some way, the Trump tariffs are having an effect. And actually, imports are down year on year. Now, that might be in part due to a hangover from pre-tariffs, so surge in imports pre the tariffs, from front running, but it also may be an indication of weaker demand. Again, it's one of these mixed messages that's coming out of the US, and this is something that we're going to have to keep a pretty close eye on over the coming few months as well. Switching to South Africa, last week the South African PMI data came out, just like it did for most countries across the globe. And the latest reading was quite encouraging, suggesting that there is an uptick in economic activity. The reading was above 50 and above the recent average. And that series does correlate quite strongly with GDP growth. So should it be the case that the PMI series remains at and around current levels, then there probably is going to be some upside to South African growth forecasts, in the same way that there may be upside to US growth forecasts if the PMI series remains as it is. It's not all good news in SA. Our broad SOE index is stagnating. There has been some good news lately in the ports with regards to the number of containers that are handled, but our series takes into consideration that, plus the performance at Eskom, plus the performance of the railway network. And in aggregate, there's little sign so far to suggest that the broad SOE index is picking up. So in effect, we've got a combination of factors in SA. It looks like the private sector is potentially starting to accelerate, but we still do have this headwind, which is SOE performance, and it is something we'll monitor very closely over the few months. And hopefully, if we see that series pick up more broadly, and we've got a PMI series pick up, that should be very helpful for SA Inc. shares. And that's where we're going to leave it for this week.
That's all for this episode. Do tune in next week for more investment insights from me, Chris Holdsworth, and the Investec Wealth and Investment team. If you haven't yet added us to your podcast feed, you can subscribe to Investec Focus Radio SA wherever you listen. And please take a minute to rate our podcast so we can surface this content to the broader investment community. If you want to see the graphs that are referenced in the podcast, you can watch a video version of this recording at investec.com/Macro Monday.
The views expressed are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily represent the views of Investec Wealth and Investment International and should not be taken as advice, guidance, or recommendation. Investec Wealth and Investment International, a member of the JSE Equity, Equity Derivatives, Currency Derivatives, Bond Derivatives, and Interest Rate Derivatives markets, an authorized financial services provider and a registered credit provider.